everybody. I hope you have thoroughly read Chapter 2 and you kind of have an understanding of what is going on in that chapter, because it is kind of the foundation. You've got to make sure that you're able to get a or select the right classification, and then once you do that, you've got to determine, of course, the load. As I said, these are building blocks, so it's very important that you go through and you spend a little time. This video is going to take probably about 18-20 minutes. Sorry about that, but I want to make sure that we get everything over it, so try to block a little bit time for that. So we're going to be spending just a little time talking about occupancy classifications. And remember, I said the projected occupant load or expected number of people that will be in the building is very important. It's that building block that we see. Occupancy classifications and occupant loads is a sense they're really dependent on each other, and they have to be considered together to determine your classification, and then from there your load, because your load may affect your occupancy classification. As we talked about last time, there's lots of different risk factors that also has to be associated with that. So you need to kind of make sure that you've looked at the type of activity occurring, the expected number of occupants, and any unusual hazards or risk factors that are present. Okay. So following all that, that's kind of like what we've been working on, that big chunk. We're going to then go into knowing, of course, the type of construction, the allowable floor area and height that you can have. We're going to look at any special occupancy requirements. We're going to get into the means of egress. We're going to talk about fire resistance and fire protection. All of those stem from what you select when you're doing your occupancy classification and your load. So that's why it's very important that you kind of know that. And if you're not sure, what did I say? Talk to your jurisdiction, your inspector of that area. One of the things is, remember in the IBC code book in Chapter 2, there is all types of definitions. In your textbook on page 84, it talks about different types of definitions. So you need to make sure you understand what they are. A building type is a particular class or category within an occupancy. Kind of the example, high school is a building type within an educational occupancy. So it would be educational would be the occupancy, even though it's a high school. Occupant load, of course, is the number of persons for which the means of egress of a building or portion thereof is designed. The occupant load sets the minimum level of exiting that must be provided. Well, when we talk about means of egress, we're talking about how many doors do we have to get out of that particular building? How many ways can you get out of that building? So occupant content is the actual number of total occupants for which exiting has been provided. So each door, means of egress, that's going to have a number of people that can safely get out of that environment. This is the maximum number of people that can occupy the space. Sometimes people call it the actual number. Then you have occupiable space. It's a room or enclosed space designed for human occupancy in which individuals congregate for amusement, educational, or similar purposes, or when occupants are engaged at labor, and which is equipped with means of egress, lighting, ventilation facilities, and they meet the requirements of this code. So it's just a space. It could be a space within a space. It's an occupiable space. It's not like a closet, but because somebody's not going to be sitting in the closet, it's referred to as the occupiable. What are you designing or what are you constructing that will allow someone to be within that space? The person occupant is a person or people using that space, whether it's a tenant, employees, customers. So the occupants of a travel agency would be included, and also the clients that would be coming in. So therefore you see your agents, the people who work in that particular space or business, and along with any clients that come in. Those are your occupants. Then you see something called use group or type. Depending on the code, use group or type can be defined numerous ways. Refer to the whole occupancy classification, or it can represent a particular class or category within an occupancy. So we might say that we have a library building, but within the library you have reading rooms, and you also have stack areas. So sometimes you have to look at the subdivisions within a particular category or use group. Now, we know every building has to be assigned an occupancy classification. That's the first thing you're going to consider. So some buildings may be predetermined, and new buildings or a new tenant may be determined separately. Remember, if a building is designed for a particular occupancy, like we said, a bar, and then all of a sudden the bar is relocated and an office goes in there. So we might have the bar, which is an assembly, but now we're going to a lawyer's office. That's going to be a business. So occupancy classifications may change. In our codes, we have to look at all of these items that you see here. Accessibility, alarm systems, egress, emergency lighting, fire extinguishing, furniture selection, means of egress, occupant loads, plumbing fixtures, smoke barriers, smoke detection systems. All of these are things that depend on what we pick out as our classification, because it means we're going to have to make sure that it meets that particular classification. So all of these are going to be very important that you see on this list. So occupancy definition: structures or portion thereof classified with respect to occupancy into one or more listed occupancy groups. Remember, we said it could be assembly, even though there's the A1, A2, A3, A4 of assembly, if you look at it in your life safety code book. Business, educational, that's of course 6 or more students that are together, all the way up to K-12, factory or industrial. There's hazardous, there's institutional, there's different types of institutional, there's mercantile, there's residential. Remember, there's different types of R1, R2, R3, R4. You need to look at it. Storage, utility, and miscellaneous. So remember, your occupancy classification structure proposed for use not listed to be classified in the occupancy group refer to its most nearly resembles. What is it close to? Based on fire safety and hazardous involvement. Always look at the most restrictive. You're going to hear me say that, most restrictive. If you're not sure, what have I always said? Ask your jurisdiction. They make the final decision. And a lot of times you can't argue with them. You just have to go with them. So we talked about classification. You've got to know the type of activity, expected number of occupants, and whether any unusual hazards or risk factors are present. Remember, we talked about new or existing. If the occupancy in a building or space was constructed for occupancy, that's great. But if there's a new addition or existing building is not used for what it was built for, then there may be some things that change. Occupancy remaining the same building but not changing its size can affect sometimes subclassifications. Now, in the Life Safety Code, because LCS separates its regulations into 2 different categories, new or existing. So a lot of times, if you've got that existing space or a new building, it may make a difference. Change in occupancy classification. It's kind of like the city has adopted, of course, the IEBC allows the code official to acquire existing facilities not just new occupancies, to maintain safe environments for their occupants, even if it does not use any change. So I like an example that I gave you, the restaurant to a nightclub, or a restaurant changes the seating arrangements, the space can result in a change of occupancy. I've seen a lot of times McDonald's goes from fixed seating to other type of seating, so therefore it may change, of course, its occupancy load in its classification. It can change whether it's sprinkled or not sprinkled. So you need to kind of look at that and see. Okay, now what we're going to talk about today is more than one occupancy type. When there are two or more occupancies can occur in the same building. Can you think of an example when there might be two or more in the same building type? So look on page 86 in your text. They kind of give you a list, because it could be like hotels. You might have a restaurant. You might have ballrooms. So that means, or workout rooms. So you may have assembly in a business, or an elementary, or middle school, or high school. That means you might have the gymnasium, which is an auditorium, which would be assembly. And then you might end up having, of course, classrooms, which are educational. Hospitals, institutional, but then you may have a cafeteria that may be assembly. So there's several things that can go on there. So you need to make sure that you look at those and find those. Open your textbook to page 88 and look at figure 2.4. I'm going to see if I can get it up here on the screen for us, so we'll be able to see it here. See if I can get it just a little closer so that you'll be able to see this particular one. So if you're looking at this, this is talking about incidental use, okay? It's an incidental accessory occupancy. You'll find that there's like laundry room in this particular space, which is a preschool classroom, which is 5,000 square feet, okay? And in that, you can see they have a laundry room. It's incidental. Why would it be incidental? If you look at this in there, you will say that rooms are considered incidental by codes or tags, and could be spaces include boiler rooms, furnished rooms, laundry rooms, any other spaces containing either hazardous items or machinery. They cannot exceed 10% of the building area of the floor in which it's located. So if it's several rooms or whatever, it cannot be over 10% of that particular area. That is what's considered incidental. Okay, if we look at accessory occupancies, you can go to page 89 in your text, or figure 2.5, which is on page 90, and it talks a little bit about more occupancies that exist, but one of them is much smaller than the other type. It may be considered an accessory. For instance, an area may be considered smaller use of classification if it's less than 10% of the total area. So let me turn so we can see here. Here's an example up at the top on page 90. You can see we have Walmart, like in through here, but then we might have a smaller little restaurant, hair salon, photo shop, all these others, but they've got to be 10% less than the total. It may be totally open. The spaces are open with one another so that you can see it. Now, if you look at B here, this is 98,800, but this is the warehouse, of course, Plan B, it has no accessory because it is totally separated and it's more than the 10%. So we may end up having mixed occupancies. That's where 2 or more occupancies in a building or space about the same size. And if you refer to page 91, it kind of talks about mixed occupancy. It's separated mixed occupancies and non-separated mixed occupancies. When the different occupancies are divided by the required rated assemblies. What we talk about, what are required rated assemblies? Those are walls, floors, and ceilings. These occupancies are considered by the IBC to be separated mixed occupancies. So when you look at that, that means they have been segregated by those walls, and there may be a fire barrier that is used within those. When there's no rated separation between the occupancies, that means no walls, maybe no ceilings, the floor. When the occupancies are considered non-separated, each of the occupancies must then meet the requirements of the most stringent occupancy classification. So if we have a restaurant and it has a gift shop, so we know the gift shop is mercantile, but the restaurant is, depending on how many people are sitting there, would be some type of assembly. So we would have to go with the most restrictive. That means we would have to use assembly for the whole building, even though the gift shop is there. Now, if it is less than 10%, then that's something that we wouldn't have to, we would still go with the assembly. So you have to kind of look at those things to try to determine. And you can see that kind of looking on page 92 of your textbook. Let me get this back over. You can see the example that I showed you. Here's the restaurant and here's the gift shop. But since this is larger, this is assembly, and this of course is your mercantile, then you would end up having to use that. Okay, so a couple other things that you might end up looking at is the NFPA codes designated how in a mixed separated multiple occupancies should be handled. More particularly, information on multiple occupancies can be found within each category chapter. So kind of look at what you see in mixed occupancies, and you can see that in your textbook on page 94. So hopefully you have kind of understood a little bit. We have another segment of this which is going to be accessibility requirements. So I will get into that a little bit later. So hopefully you have read this chapter, reread it, and bring questions, of course, on Tuesdays and Thursdays to our virtual class. Talk to you later. Bye.